Well, good afternoon, everybody, and thank you very much, Anine, and thank you to our speakers. It's great to be here, and I'm really looking forward to this event. It will follow our normal course, we hope, which will be that that the two authors will talk about their books respectively, and then we have our most distinguished commentator who will talk about the books and ask a few questions, and then after an hour or maybe a little bit more, we'll turn to the audience, and then because it's in a meeting format, we can be quite informal and have a really nice discussion. But we won't go over the 2-hour mark, simply because we know that everybody has very busy lives and they've got lots of things to do, and so on and so on and so on. So I think that's really plenty from me, except perhaps just to say that Maya Unnithan, talking about fertility, health, and reproductive politics, reimagining rights in India, is a professor at the University of Sussex and a trustee of the RAI, and has made an enormous contribution to our work over many decades now. So thank you very much, Maya. And our the second book, Childlessness in Bangladesh: Intersectionality, Suffering and Resilience, by Papreen Nahar. We're also very pleased to welcome also in Sussex, but at the Medical School of Sussex and Brighton. And our commentator, Anindita Majumdar, joins us as a most distinguished specialist in reproductive technologies from India. So, and also thank you very much for joining us at this hour. So that's by way of introductions, and now we turn to our first speaker to present her book, and that's quite enough from me. So thank you very much indeed.
Thank you. I think I'm the first speaker. Thank you, Dr. Shaklan, for your kind words. I'd like to extend my thanks to the Royal Anthropological Institute for organizing this joint book event. And thank you, Hanin, for all your effort for this event. It's my great pleasure and honor to be able to discuss my book together with Professor Maya Unnithan's book and having Professor Anindita Majumdar as a discussant. The two women that I admire for their contribution to the discipline of gender and anthropology, and particularly on reproductive health and infertility. I'll shortly introduce my book, but let me share my screen first. I hope this is visible.
Looks good.
Thank you. The title of my book is Childlessness in Bangladesh: Intersectionality, Sufferings and Resilience, published by Routledge in 2022. I'll briefly highlight some of the themes that I have addressed in my book. Firstly, I'd like to talk about biosociality aspects of infertility. It has been well documented that infertility carries a social construction based on complex set of beliefs and values that in turn shape the meaning of infertility within a society. Anthropologists have documented the ways in which societies regulate the politics of reproduction and deal with the issues of reproductive impairment, as well as the differences in reproductive motivations in different societies. Infertility, therefore, a complex interaction between not only biological and cultural, but also structural factors, and can be a source of social, psychological, economic, emotional consequences for the people with infertility. WHO has published infertility prevalence early this year, and that roughly 1 in 6 people worldwide infertile. That's the prevalence of infertility, and amongst these, almost 18% in high-income countries and 16.5% in low-income countries. However, it's worthy to mention here that this study actually did not include Asia because of the lack of data. And in this presentation, I'd like to mention that, I mean, it's very common knowledge that there are two types of childlessness. One is voluntary, the other is involuntary. And in my case, I'll be talking about involuntary childlessness. In my book, I have used the concept of sufferings by Arthur Kleinman and resilience by James Scott, and also intersectionality by Stelmach and Collins. I'm not going to go into detail in this here. And my study was a qualitative ethnographic study. I have conducted life histories with educated middle-class, urban educated middle-class women, and also illiterate rural poor women in Bangladesh. Through an ethnographic approach, I have observed the life of childless women in their natural settings. And I have also collected community data through focus group discussions, a number of participatory rapid appraisal, and also I did key informant interviews with the policymakers and different stakeholders. For those who are not very familiar with the context of Bangladesh, Bangladesh is the 8th most populous countries in the world, with a population exceeding 163 million people. It is one of the most densely populated countries, and it has a predominantly Muslim population. It is situated in South Asia. The country is relatively new. It has got its independence only in 1971. Although the feminization of employment has taken place in Bangladesh with increased involvement of women in various industries such as garment factory, this has not significantly altered the subordinate gender position assigned to women culturally. However, women in Bangladesh are not homogeneous group, rather come from diverse socioeconomic and cultural background, ranging from highly educated, affluent to illiterate poor women. I have been doing infertility research since 2000, found no national studies has been conducted to determine the epidemiological factors surrounding infertility yet. However, Bangladesh has a high prevalence of risk factors for infertility, including STDs, RTI, malnutrition, air pollution, and so on. Social reactions to infertility are directly related to the value of fertility. In other words, the value of motherhood. Historically, motherhood is seen as a glorified position for women in both, as you know, in the Western and non-Western cultures, regardless of whether a mother's life is as glorified in reality. In Bangladesh, however, the dominant state ideology is to control fertility. Consequently, the family planning program is a success story of the country, not only within the country, but within the region. The total fertility rate was above 7 in the early 70s, but it has now merely 2.2. It is a sharp decline for any demographic context. Although it is an antinatalist state, but as a society, Bangladesh is a pronatalist. All dominant religions of the country, Islam, Christianity, Buddhism, Hinduism, pay high tribute to motherhood due to the motherhood, and this is very much embedded in the culture. Also, due to the absence of welfare system, children are necessary to secure parents' survival. They serve as a valuable power source, not only economically, but also for other cultural and religious reasons. In societies where motherhood is highly valued, childlessness there destroys the identity of womanhood. The cultural construction of infertility, that's what one of my framework of analyzing the data. While I was exploring the cultural construction of infertility in rural Bangladesh, it has been revealed how the community diagnosed infertility through social scrutiny. For example, in the rural area, when a married woman does not conceive within 1 or 2 years of her marriage, she would be considered as infertile. To indicate a man as infertile, however, the community would wait until man's old age or to see the outcome of any subsequent marriage of that man. While exploring the local vocabularies of infertility, the studies has identified 18 terms for childless women, most of which have negative connotation attached with, and only a few terms used for male infertility, which are usually neutral. Through the pile sorting exercise, it has been revealed the community considers infertility more as a social problem rather than a health problem. The exploration of cultural construction confirms that infertility provides social identity to the sufferer, who is commonly a woman. The added proverb in this screen give an idea of the way infertility or childlessness is constructed in the society. Four naturalistic and personalistic categories of perceived causes are found for infertility in the community that I worked. An ethnophysiological creature called Juha Juhi was found to be the main perceived cause of infertility. And here is some pattern of the insect that they think is the main cause for infertility. And this, I have done body mapping exercise in order to understand more about this insect. So the consequences, the experience of rural and urban childless women in Bangladesh vary due to their different lifestyles and identities. In comparison to urban childless women, their rural counterparts face more pronounced societal pressure of blame and accusation. Rural women face divorce, violence, remarriage, and abandonment as consequences for their childlessness. The well-being of urban childless women is affected in different forms. They suffer from loss of privacy, social isolation, and low self-esteem. Although both urban and rural childless women face blame for their infertility to be unable to bear a child, the accusations are different between them. For rural women, the stigma is much more open, whereas urban childless women experience a subtle form of stigmatization. The meaning and value of child differs between urban and rural societies. However, the sanctity of motherhood is the same in both groups. Both feel that they run against the social norms and that their childlessness results in social deviance. The essence of this deviant identity is suffering and violence, but the two different groups face them on a different level. Here is a quotation from an urban educated middle-class woman. She was actually doing her PhD during my fieldwork, and that's how she felt about it. I'm not going to read this one, but I will be reading another quotation from a rural childless woman. And just to give you an idea about their life. I think actually I will skip reading it. I'll give you 30 seconds to read this quotation. I'll move this slide now. I hope you have read it. Apart from sociocultural consequences, there are economic consequences as well. Treatment cost for ART is the main economic consequences or concern for urban middle-class childless women, whereas for the rural poor, there are at least 6 other concerns, and which I call 6 Ds. Again, it's I'm not going to go into details, but particularly it becomes more difficult for the husbands because the husbands become demoralized and the earning of the family gets reduced due to their childlessness. I have also written a chapter on health-seeking pattern of the childless women of urban and rural in my book, and where I highlighted the medical pluralism is a common phenomenon in Bangladesh, and also it's not different for childlessness. Women usually are the main focus of fertility treatment. Rural women depend almost exclusively on the traditional healing system in the absence of availability of infertility treatment in the formal sector. They constantly actually keep on trying with the traditional domain, resulting in a never-ending lonely journey to the goal of motherhood. As a result of medical plurality, on the other hand, the urban childless women who predominantly depend on biomedical system also seek spiritual solution at certain points in their treatment pathways for various pragmatic and spiritual reasons. My study presents how urban middle-class women in Bangladesh embark on an IVF journey must navigate complex and uncertain terrain. It is apparent that the health-seeking journey of Bangladeshi childless women is stratified, and intersectional position of a childless woman determine the nature of her health-seeking pathway. However, commonalities were also observed in which both rural and urban childless women typically initiate their own treatment and both face intense experience along their respective treatment-seeking journeys. In this slide, I'm just showing that in this chapter, I have also captured the pathways of treatment seeking both for urban and rural and showed the similarities and differences between them. And I explained it at the lonely journey of childless women for both of them, for urban and rural. The health-seeking related consequences shows for urban women, economic burden is the main one, but it is not less for the rural women as well, although it might sound that rural women actually seek their treatment all through their life through the traditional healing system and which are cheaper, but because of the extended period of their life, because this they start their treatment from very early age and continue till the end of reproductive age. So it continues for longer time, and at the end, they end up by spending a lot of money on treatment in very many traditional healing system. And also, there are some similarities in terms of bodily harm and psychological trauma and so on are almost same for both type of treatment-seeking pathways. I have also discussed a chapter on policy situation in my book, and I interviewed actually with the stakeholders, and that those interviews revealed that infertility in Bangladesh is not a priority on anyone's agenda. The lack of infertility services in the public sector indicates a failure to ensure health equity in the system. Various authorities, including government, NGOs, and international, criticized there is no evidence of infertility problem for an intervention. On the other hand, the researchers stated there is no funding can be obtained to conduct infertility research. So it was a kind of merry-go-round. I have started from international organization. They shifted the responsibility to the government high officials. They shifted to the researchers, and at the end, I got to know that actually it is no one's agenda. Basically, a group of stakeholders were shifting the responsibilities to the others, including international, national, NGOs, and so on. It shows how infertile women's lives are lives have not been seen, known, and identified in the macro level conceptualization of women's health. It confirms the ongoing invisibility of infertile women's lives at both micro and macro level. I argued in the book, infertile women who are considered undesirable and unacceptable by the society are also undergo a systematic process of exclusion by the state. Even though the childless women in Bangladesh suffer profoundly from various forms of ostracism, my study shows childless women also contest their stigmatized identity through everyday form of resistance, and through overt and covert strategies. Rural women apparent to be more resilient compared to the urban women. For example, rural women take initiative for their treatment without any support, and they prevent their abandonment, increase socialization, make ally with the community, and avoid social gathering. On the other hand, urban women, although they are less resilient, but they also take some initiative, and more prominently, they try to develop alternative identities, which is slightly different from the rural counterpart. The study revealed that alarming account of stigma, abuse, and violence against childless women who shared their experience of marginalization in a culture that idealizes motherhood. This book expanded the current discourse on infertility by delineating the intersectionality of the stratified experience of rural poor and urban middle-class childless women in Bangladesh. Enormous disparities exist between these two groups in terms of education, economic status, geographic location, and mobility. These disparities in turn affect the ways in which they respond to and deal with the childlessness. The form of everyday resistance is also different between urban and rural childless women in Bangladeshi society. Childless women are placed in various stratified positions based on their point of intersection of numerous axes of power. And in my last slide, I'd like to say that basically I will actually conclude my presentation with the concept with which I had started writing my book with, and the concept of negative knowing. It refers to the paradox of noticing things and people more in their absence than in their presence. This epistemological path, along with its obstacles, brings us closer to understanding the meaning of both pregnancy and the birth of children. Since the absence of children allows one resilience and realize the significance of their presence, this raises the question, what are the lived experience of this negative knowing among childless? The data evidenced that the desire for childless women, the childless takes shape not only from experience of the negative consequences of childlessness, but more from the negative knowing referred to as emptiness. The book shows the experience of childlessness, particularly for women, can be much more severe than what is defined as infertility in the biomedical context. While high-income countries have already progressed towards debate and discussion around advanced developments such as egg freezing, through this book, I argued that progression in infertility research constitutes much more than simply the advancement and adoption of reproductive technologies. The quality of life of infertile women still remains an under-addressed issue because the problem of women's health is measured by the epidemiological index. The intensity of the problem is not included. Health priority is set based on number data only, not based on other types of evidence which captures the intensity of the problem. Experience of childlessness, I think, is an issue of reproductive justice which needs further attention. That's how I would like to conclude my presentation about my book today. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed for that fascinating insight, beautifully presented. Well, we now turn to Maya, please. Go ahead.
Thank you. Thank you very much, David and Haneen and the RAI for giving me this wonderful opportunity to be here today, and to my colleagues Papreen and Anindita for for the conversations we've had and continue to have, and for our collaboration. And I'd also like to thank everyone who's joined in and given up their precious afternoon to join us here. So I'm going to talk about my book, which is, as you know, called Fertility, Health and Reproductive Politics: Reimagining Rights in India. The book actually pulls together 20 years of work on fertility discourses and reproductive labor across sort of interconnected domains of both childbirth and loss, contraception, sex-selective abortion, surrogacy, and infertility in northern India. So it's more, going across, looking at fertility, but across a whole set of different sort of reproductive experiences that women have. During this period, the 20-year period of the book, which is 1998 to 2018, it's interesting to note that the Indian state had been engaged in both curbing its population through new forms of family planning, at the same time as it was participating in more international techniques of governance, as we see with the MDGs and the SDGs. And this participation was really seen as a means to kind of, promote and realize global reproductive sexual health rights. So this fieldwork that I carried out over the years has, which was, just before the MDGs and the SDGs came in, during when it was when they were rolled out, and also now, after these development goals have been in place for a while. And looking at it through that kind of time perspective, it made clear to me that, this kind of dual aspect of the state, that is, in terms of curtailing fertility on the one hand and enhancing choice on the other, was really embodied in the way reproductive rights were deployed in state healthcare programs for, say, safe motherhood, in terms of, say, cash incentives for giving birth in hospitals, or, for instance, the provision of contraceptive choice. So in the book, then, I set out to understand the diffusion of these global norms of sexual reproductive health rights within India, and in that sense, the rights popularly referred to in India stem from a more generic notion of rights that are called adhikar in the local language. And I look at how they circulate, get rooted in particular discursive contexts, and not maybe in other kinds of contexts, so where they get rooted, where they don't get rooted, and what this actually means at an everyday level for how community members, state health planners, medical, legal, and civil society actors actually engage with this kind of discourse on reproductive rights, how they mobilize particular agendas, and how they challenge other ideas about sort of reproductive rights. So at the same time, while doing this fieldwork, I was learning about indigenous notions of reproductive justice. And I actually came then to investigate and write about what notions of bodily autonomy and integrity come to mean in practice at two kinds of levels. Firstly, for women's own kind of quest for justice or nyay. So it's a very different word than the word adhikar. So thinking about sort of women's quest for justice in the context of not just state injunctions, but also family injunctions and obligations for bearing children, particularly in the absence of acceptable public health provisions, poor public health provisions, particularly to do with infertility. And this was set, the women respondents were sort of drawn from a peri-urban context around Jaipur district. The peri-urban context was, just outside. Is this area which, women inhabit, who are both, you can both have access to women who are in slums, but also women in villages. And the being at that peri-urban context, really in betwixt and between the rural and urban, I found was very, was very insightful in this sense. The second sort of issue that I was learning about in terms of indigenous notions of reproductive justice and ideas of bodily autonomy and integrity were about how these notions of reproductive justice were translated and how they were engaged with among civil society actors, especially the work of health-focused legal aid organizations who were engaged in translating across both sort of longer traditions of indigenous reproductive claims making and related concepts and language, and the more sort of universal language of rights, which was being used in development programs and in the law. So the older, again, this was a difference between thinking about haq, the older, the sort of more indigenous ways of claiming rights, and adhikar, the way the word right appears in the law and development speak. So overall, the work underpinning the book then suggests that while rights-based protocols are themselves increasingly powerful instruments which promote and reinforce autonomy and the self-determination of individuals, and in fact have become social facts in this sense, that is, they exist, people engage with them, but they are limited in that they obscure other modes of being, belonging, rights-based claiming, which are predicated on sort of diverse knowledges of health and healing and the body. And actually, these are more morally situated claim making that take place in the more sort of indigenous language of reproductive justice. So the idea of justice then is important because beyond rights, it kind of engages with an individual's and a community's moral sense of what is right, of what rights should be. And therefore, I found it really sort of important to try and understand and to examine the relationship actually between rights and justice as they emerged on the ground, as it were. So, and this kind of relationship between rights and justice was powerfully brought home to me by the women and men whose lives I document in the book. And in the saying that, rights, adhikar, have arrived, but justice, nyay, has not followed. So the sentiment that rights have failed in delivering justice was also widespread amongst, health workers, legal aid activists, and development actors in Rajasthan. People who have devoted their lives to actually promoting gender equality and reproductive and sexual health and well-being. So just to give you some examples, and there are, I can't cover everything that was in the book, but I will try and give you some examples of the kind of complex sort of navigations that were being made on the ground in the context of this relationship between rights and reproductive justice, and around sort of reproductive violence that Papreen has also talked about in terms of infertility. So, for example, there is reproductive violence, for example, against a woman in a household, and it can take a number of forms, from both dowry demands to, for instance, not becoming pregnant in a specific period of time, to not, even when you do become pregnant, to not completing household chores. So these may all be contexts where actual physical violence may be meted out to women in the households. From 2005, there have, however, been attempts by legal aid lawyers to provide reproductive legislation that, for example, draws on existing acts like the Protection of Women from Domestic Violence Act 2005 to ensure that women have the right to reside in the home and not get, basically thrown out or excluded because of these particular reasons for violence. But in that process, on the one hand, women have themselves want to enable that they can continue to have access to their survival needs, that is, being in the household, and through the final provision that is given to them. But somehow ensuring this right has not delivered justice, because the women, while they might have gained the right to residence and reside in their final home, they still find themselves living precisely with the perpetrators of that violence and alongside the ideology of a patriarchy that gives their affines and affinal relatives an entitlement over their bodies. So this is where, rights have arrived, but justice doesn't seem to have come. And there is, and it is really looking at that gap between justice and rights that one can see how, how infertility and the suffering of infertility or reproductive related issues continue to, have a deep sort of impact in terms of the way women are treated as unequal. Another disjunction, and I'm just giving you some examples now, but another disjunction between rights, for example, in terms of the word choice, and reproductive justice was the way in which the state, for example, in its programs around contraception, drew on ideas of choice. For example, the idea of a cafeteria of contraceptive choice in its family planning program. And this was seen to help empower women because it enables them to space their births. But this took place in a context where women, at least the respondents who I came across, both who had given birth as well as those who hadn't given birth, experienced, a high level of reproductive tract infections, and related to that, a high level of secondary infertility. That is, you can't have a child after your first child because of these reproductive tract infections. And because of the poor healthcare or the non-existent healthcare, you are actually unable to give birth. So in fact, there is a tremendous pervasive fear in the use of contraceptives because of the idea that contraceptives actually will continue to curtail fertility in the long run, with drastic consequences for women's status within the household, and also in terms of their access to power and social capital. And ultimately, the social entitlement that is associated with reproductive health, with being well in terms of, being able to reproduce safely with dignity, being healthy, and your own well-being is also at the forefront. This kind of entitlement was provided not so much by the state, but indeed by indigenous healers who were able to balance the inequity of social relations within the household. And so in this context, in fact, reproductive health emerges for the women as something not a biological kind of disease that has to be overcome through access to public health care, but in fact, in terms of being auspicious, being more, regaining their personhood in terms of inequitous kind of social relations. And actually, it's this not, and actually, it is the non-understanding of that drives women to seek healers as people who mete out justice. Another example is really about the complex ways in which even the safe birth programs that are, safe motherhood programs that are meted out by the state in terms of enabling women to come to hospitals and which are seen as places which can provide safe childbirth. And in that sense, they are seen by the state to meet the rights and help empower women. That actually these kinds of programs, as the Jan Swasthya, Jan Suraksha Yojana, and have what they have done in a very complex way is that because they are connected so much with cash, providing cash incentives, that what's happened is that they've actually engendered a sense more of reproductive health entitlement from the state and rights as something that is actually measurable by cash. And that women are going there and are being taken there, whether they might want to or not, by relatives, by midwives, by state health workers, because of that access to money, and this inevitably has strengthened, this kind of perception of meeting the rights women has actually strengthened a faith at the end in market models of health. That is, again, health and well-being is a commodity which you can buy, as many others before me have talked about, say Mark Nichter, for example. And then I think I just have maybe time for another sort of complex area in terms of the entanglements of rights and injustice, and the different ways in which different groups using these ideas of rights have led to very different kinds of outcomes than we expect. And this is again in the context of sex-selective abortion. Here we find that while the state and feminist groups have really clamped down in terms of rules and regulations around female selective abortion, women's own embrace of selective reproductive technologies and their preference for aborting girls has arisen and has been motivated by a combined interest in their own sense of entitlement, that is, that they will gain better status and dignity and economic security for themselves if they give birth, for example, to boys only. But it also has a sense of protecting their daughters from the kind of from the discrimination that they would face in a context where dowry is so kind of prevalent. And so at the same time, it enables women to meet these familial and wider class-based expectations for a better social and economic sort of reproduction of the family following the birth of sons. And in order for them to do this, an interesting alliance has been formed with private local doctors who actually support, as they put it, women's choice. And they do that by drawing on the language of universal rights and bodily rights to say that they are actually helping women do what they want with their bodies. So I'm actually going to, I'm not sure if I should. Do I have another minute or two, or
Of
maybe?
course. Take a minute, please.
Okay, well,
Fascinating. Please.
I'll just maybe try. There is no sort of solution as such, but all I think we can do as anthropologists is to really show how these complexities emerge on the ground, and particularly towards the sort of more later parts of my fieldwork, in my meetings with legal activists in India, for instance, in 2017 and 2018, I was struck by the number of bills and petitions that had been through the courts involving gender and bodily rights, say on forced sterilizations or child marriage or triple talaq, which is, against the legitimacy of the annulment of marriage within Muslim personal law, or, against dowry and rape, including the complex entanglement of marital rape and rape in child marriage, and by the sort of increasing legal activism that has made these issues sort of visible in the courts. According to some of the legal aid people who are spearheading this, in Delhi, for instance, they said that there's been a sea change in the language of the courts. We are now talking about bodily integrity and not about population control. Again, here, we and new forms of sort of public interest litigation petitions. Again, a key trope through which the reproductive rights cases are being presented in the courts has been something very distinctive in of what's happening in the Indian sort of legal system. So there is, on the one hand, there is things happening in the courts which are very interesting, where reproductive rights are emerging and not emerging. There are ways in which the state is actually getting more and more empowered through the provision, and is seen to be providing things for meeting women's reproductive rights on the ground. And yet, in large part, the idea that justice hasn't arrived was something that was very, very evident in what people were kind of saying, and what was being evidenced in terms of their own health and well-being. And in general, I think, again, there's been lots of work done on, for instance, lawfare, and how the courts are being sort of very important in mobilizing issues. But again, to what extent is that useful when women on themselves find they have to rely on and go back to people in the household with particular kind of patriarchal kind of ideas in terms of entitlements to their body. So if the womb is controlled by others, then how can you talk about gaining any kinds of control over your own sort of reproduction? In the context of an increasingly strategic and expansive sexual and reproductive rights work, which is undertaken by, say, legal aid organizations in India, that is a form of gender and justice oriented kind of work that's going on. And one just hopes, well, I want to end on something positive, that there will be a context where women will be able to feel that actually we have received justice. Nyay mil gaya. Thank you.
Oh, thank you. Thank you so much for these wonderfully complimentary presentations. That was as enthralling as it was also worrying. Anyway, we now turn to our distinguished discussant, who will discuss. So please go ahead.
Thank you, David, for being so kind. I had a fantastic time reading both Maya and Papreen's books for reasons. I mean, Maya has been very important to my academic career in reproductive health. Papreen is an inspiration for reproductive health work coming in from Bangladesh. So it is a huge honor to discuss their work. I hope I can do justice to both the books, and I'll try to stay within time. The magic of thinking about reproductive health in South Asia begins with a detailed and incisive retelling of narratives of women as they experience their reproductive selves in the everyday. In Papreen Nahar and Maya Unnithan's wonderful ethnographies, the lived experiences of navigating reproductive health amongst women in South Asia becomes more stark, resplendent of the gendered navigation of childlessness. Here I offer some key insights into how the two books provide important ways to engage with and think about reproductive health from the vantage point of so-called populist cultures. Both Unnithan's and Papreen's books bring together ethnographic research on the idea of reproduction in South Asia and its mediation through complex terrains of health-seeking, stigma, policy imperatives, and reproductive justice. Both the books are important in the ways in which they frame reproductive justice, and this is linked to the idea that South Asia is completely consumed within larger discourses around population planning and control. So some of the major themes that I discuss across the two books are, the first is, of course, the Global South and the problem with population discourse. Both Childlessness in Bangladesh and Reimagining Rights in India provoke us to think about recent conversations on overpopulation in South Asia. Since many decades, the focus on population control and family planning has meant that Bangladesh and India continue to engage with reproductive rights through the prism of antinatalism at the state level. The two ethnographies highlight the dynamism of meanings attached to fertility in the region. In Bangladesh, the representation of the violence that is wreaked upon infertile poor women is distressing and highlights the gap between policy and social life. In India, the role of legislative mediation often takes into account societal valuations and norms, usually nodding to patriarchal practices. Tracing the long and contested history of reproductive rights in India, Unnithan unpacks the fertile subject as mediated through reproductive rights and practices that are negotiated in courts, grassroots outreach, and biomedical interventions. The always and forever fertile Bangladeshi and Indian women are presented as complex objects constructed through state intervention and emerging cultures of biomedical extraction. However, in reality, in the ethnography, both in India and Bangladesh, emerging technologies of infertility care, such as in vitro fertilization, have rendered the fertile subject more and more vulnerable. The second theme that I think is essential to both the books is that of making reproductive justice and rights a bureaucratic priority. Due to the overt focus on population control and family planning, state attention is largely towards reproductive health planning, health mapping as a form of target-oriented intervention into limiting births in India and Bangladesh. In Nahar's ethnography, this focus has meant that both international funding agencies and the government of Bangladesh do not identify infertility and childlessness to be policy priorities. This form of myopia sadly means that women have no access to information regarding infertility treatment or to provide treatment that is affordable. In India, however, Unnithan finds a more complicated discourse surrounding policy imperatives and reproductive health. For instance, policy and systemic intervention in female selective abortions, or FSAs, operates within a checkered terrain of reproductive morality, where the law on abortion must operate within rising anxieties regarding declining sex ratio. And at the same time, there is emerging legal intervention, assisted reproduction, and allied activities such as surrogacy that tend to prioritize a form of morality linked to the eulogization of altruism and non-payment of surrogacy services and reproductive leave. The third theme that becomes essential to both the books is that of engaging with alternative health seeking in reproduction and infertility. Building on the varied levels of engagement in both the ethnographies is the sustained focus on alternative health seeking. I think this is, I think the focus on alternative health seeking is particularly, I think it's a very relevant and timely input, especially in terms of looking at what is fertility and moving again away from, again, this kind of separation from biomedicine and non-biomedicine, but to actually critique this kind of separation and look at how patients and women engage with different kinds of health seeking. Unnithan focuses on the charismatic faith healers in Rajasthan who are able to guide difficult cases of infertility amongst rural and urban poor women through the reinvigoration of shared familial connections and duties. And in Nahar's ethnography, faith healers are important to the difficult negotiation of infertility amongst Bangladeshi women. Both the rural poor and urban middle class in Bangladesh seek out alternative healing to overcome infertility and childlessness, as well as quell dissonance within intimate relations. In Nahar's ethnography, alternative health providers have elaborate descriptions and practices related to childlessness. Localizing reproductive health ailments through symbolic representations of intrusive spirit possession does not take away from the fact that seeking these treatments is affordable and helps women buy time in households where divorce or abandonment may be preeminent due to their childlessness. Faith healing in India brings in diverse stakeholders by asking the patrilineage to be accountable to a woman's reproductive health ailments and distress. And finally, the essential focus on the relational is also an important hallmark of both the books, where reproduction is brought back to the intimate space of the patriarchal family, the patrilineage, and the role that the family plays in reproductive decision-making, social policing, and exclusion in both the ethnographies in India and Bangladesh. In Unnithan's ethnography, the conversations in and around reproductive choice are navigated largely through the relational. As community health workers known as auxiliary nurse, midwives, ANMs, and accredited social health activists, ASHAs, Indian women navigate familial and social constraints to achieving access to safe birthing practices. At the same time, feminist support groups working as mediation and counseling centers for women seeking legal support for their reproductive rights also depend heavily upon familial networks rather than courts to resolve outstanding issues. The intimate familial network in Bangladesh comes to be separated on class lines in the mediation of childlessness. Rural childless Bengali women face censure and violence from their partners and in-laws with little or no support, while urban childless Bengali women are able to circumvent some of the overt violence through support from spouses. Here, Nahar stresses to a large extent on the fragility of the conjugal bond in the shadow of infertility. The constant threat of divorce and abandonment makes life a struggle for many rural childless women. And while urban women are better off in terms of familial support, the threat of divorce still exists in the background. I will discuss more points, and I hope to bring up more while as we open this up. But I enjoyed reading both these books and would like to thank the authors Papreen Nahar and Maya Unnithan, as well as the Journal of the Royal Anthropological Institute for this opportunity. I hope I've been able to do justice to both the books together and individually. In closing, I have some questions that I would like to ask the authors to kickstart the discussion on and about the books. I'd like to begin with Papreen. So Papreen, I have two questions for you. The first is, do you think highlighting infertility and childlessness as reasons for gender-based violence will get the attention of policymakers? And if yes, what form of policy activism is required to push this imperative? That's my first question. And should I go ahead? Do you want to respond to this, or should I just start?
Oh, yes. One at a time, please. One at a time. Always better. Thank you so much. Go ahead, please, Papreen.
Papreen, you have to unmute yourself.
Sorry. Thank you so much, Dr. Majumdar, for presenting our books and giving your views about these books as well. The question about putting it into gender-based violence framework, whether this is going to create a shake to the policymakers, I think it's hard to say because I mean, there are very many frameworks that have been used in very many different contexts in order to bring infertility into the discussion, into the policy attention. For example, I mean, after a long neglect of infertility, the neglected disease was one of the frameworks that some of the scholars have started discussing it and also trying to draw attention from the policymakers. And then another group of scholars also put infertility within the framework of disability. And then other, as you know, in the current era, we can see that SRHR is another framework. And also, like, for very many framework, very many different times, scholars from different contexts were trying to bring this, but it seems that nothing had worked. And particularly if we try to bring this within the gender-based violence framework, I don't think in case of Bangladesh, this is going to be work very well. partly because of still now gender-based violence is, the way gender-based violence is framed in Bangladesh is mostly focusing on physical abuse and sexual abuse and so on, but really do not focus much on psychological abuse and other form of abuses. So, but it's part of it, of course. And so that's, I'm not extremely hopeful that gender-based violence framework will work in case of Bangladesh. Instead, probably right now, if we can think about like the very current framework, for example, universal health coverage, that might work to some extent, and justice framework probably would work better compared to the other, the gender-based violence framework. And also, I mean, it's not only the national level. I think from the international level, there should be, it's a time to discuss about it. For example, from WHO, they are currently paying attention to this issue. And if there is a, I mean, if they produce a guideline for infertility services, probably that would work better. And for a country like Bangladesh, as you know, that in most cases, it's the decision is not entirely made by the local policymakers, and it's influenced by the international policymakers and international organizations. So there has to be like integration between the international policymakers and local makers. And, only then there will be something included within the reproductive health policy on infertility. And also, I think, I mean, issues like gender-based violence, for this kind of issues, probably there has to be a regional movement, like in South Asian group of different scholars group or different activist group, if they can make an integrated like activism, then probably it would create a shake to the policymakers in Bangladesh. Does it give a response to your question?
Yeah, I was, because there is reference to such deep violence in your ethnography. I would believe that there is a strong case, but of course, the realities of how the state works and how policy works are different from each, you know, but I think there is, your ethnography is the beginning to make such a case. Okay, I just wanted to ask David, should I ask the second question? Should I ask Maya the next question, and then again go back to the second question to Papreen and the second question to Maya, or should I ask them both?
Yes, that's right. Let's go to Maya next, and that way we gradually bring everybody in.
Great. Okay.
Yes.
All right, Maya, thanks for that. Thanks for your book. And because I work on surrogacy, and I want to ask you specifically about your conceptualization of reproductive labor, and if there is an argument for linking surrogacy and A&M ASHA work as similarly placed in thinking about labor rights and justice.
Thanks, Anindita. Yes, I think the work that, you know, the conceptual work that's gone around in terms of thinking about surrogacy as reproductive labor, and also in terms of when you think about reproduction in the format of labor, you begin to have a very different perspective on what reproduction is, in terms of both thinking about, well, you know, is this unpaid labor? Is it paid labor? And it enables us to really frame reproduction differently, because it enables us, on the one hand, to acknowledge, you know, the time, effort that has gone into reproduction, the emotion, the affect, the, you know, all that. On the one hand, but on the other hand, it then brings it within the the realm of sort of neoliberalism, within the realm of what can be what can be paid for and not paid for, and it then lands us directly into this kind of this kind of strange tension between things that are altruistic and things that are paid for. So so do we think of motherhood as altruism, or do we think of motherhood as, and actually what surrogacy has shown us really is that we have to think along both lines. We have to really think about why is altruism and motherhood and the giving free of all this labor, why should we take that for granted? We need to, as surrogates tell us, we need to wake up and think, no, that there is a cost to that. So we need to keep that on board, but at the same time we also need to think it's not that kind of cost, perhaps, or so it needs recognition, but it also cannot be reduced mainly to anything that is measured in terms of money. And I think that for me, surrogacy has shown more than any other context, linked to infertility, because of course surrogacy is connected with infertility. It has come about because of the fact that women and men and people who are infertile or who are not fertile in the way of reproduction, the fact that they can't have families, and so it is linked to infertility. But more than any other of the kind of conditions around infertility, it really shows us, as you say, this context of reproductive labor as being it really throws up this issue. Now, I wasn't quite sure what you meant by A&M and ASHA, these health providers. What were you suggesting there? I thought that was intriguing.
I'm thinking if we are looking at reproductive labor as something that can also be brought into the gamut of looking for reproductive rights and justice, can we look at women working to provide safe birthing to women in rural India as also performing a kind of reproductive labor? And can then there be a reason for a more focused, more widespread movement towards what you are fighting for in your book, for reproductive justice, where we bring in different sets of women involved in reproductive health, asking for rights and justice from a labor format?
Yes. Yes, no, I think actually what you're doing here is really opening up something, quite, I think, important and interesting, which I'm hoping to develop with you. But this idea that somehow, and I think this is where there is a slight break and disruption from radical feminists in the way they might think about both surrogacy as because both in surrogacy and in sex-selective abortion, there is this hiatus between, what women who are involved in these processes think about, desire, want in terms of rights and justice, versus, other groups of women who think about, reproductive labor as being exploited in this case. So, and in that context, I think by thinking about this whole gamut of justice in terms of reproductive labor, we need to resolve the tensions between feminists who are against this. And I think only once that is done, that we can collaboratively then do something that makes it clear to the state in some sense. Because I think unless we have those kinds of conversations, it's going to be very difficult to promote this as a kind of policy or a kind of legal kind of way of thinking about it. I don't know, but that's just my thoughts.
Thank you. Thanks. David, do you want to open this up? I still have 2 questions on ethnography, but I can defer to the audience. I can see people may want to ask questions.
Well, I'm sure everybody is enthralled at this fascinating discussion, so please carry on a bit, and then perhaps we'll open it up. So,
right.
Beloved colleagues in the audience, please just hold on a little bit, and let's hear a little bit more of this great discussion. So go ahead, please, Anindita.
Thank you, David. Thank you. I had ethnography questions from both of you. And I'm going to, from Papreen, I wanted to ask how difficult was it for you to conduct ethnographies of women suffering from trauma from continued daily intimate violence? You do describe scenes where you were unwittingly caught in feuds within the neighborhood against an infertile woman. And I wanted to ask, what can an ethnographer do in such situations? We've always been caught up in situations where there has been overt or not so overt violence that we have seen. What can an ethnographer do? And I mean, how did you manage that situation? And then I'll ask Maya her ethnography question.
Well, yes, that was like a really difficult time to when I was collecting my data. Although I'm originally from Bangladesh and I grew up, I was there up until my first master's, and I thought that I knew the society very well. I knew that there is like stigma about infertility and so on. And also I prior to this research, I have done another study on infertility in urban slum in Dhaka. So I thought I was well prepared to handle this this topic. But to my surprise, when I went to the field and heard the devastating stories of women, honestly, I was not prepared for that kind of stories and the trauma that women go through. And obviously, it had an impact on my personal well-being and psychological state as well at that time. And so it was difficult, but I was, I mean, after spending a couple of months within this rural area, when I realized that somehow I gained the trust of these women, and when they were telling me that they are, I'm the first one who actually came to them and asking about their infertility. So that gave me, to some extent, a kind of peace in my mind to think that at least by giving patients hearing and allowing them to talk about their situation might help their well-being and situation. So that, in a way, I mean, it was a difficult time in one hand. On the other hand, I put myself in a kind of position of counselor when I did not actually give any of my ideas or thoughts or thinking about, but I just gave my patients hearing, and that helped for them. And that also gave me a kind of peace in mind to deal with the trauma stories and life histories. And the other stories that you have just mentioned, that the dispute and that quarrel or the physical abuse, the stories that life history that I have explained in one chapter. On that day, I mean, of course, and also I mentioned that I was there from a certain distance. I was listening everything. I was looking at that women is physically and verbally abused by the family members and neighbors. I didn't do anything. And I came back to my temporary residence in close to the village, and spent quite some time thinking about it. And then I started blaming myself. But at the same time, I did not go, because as a young anthropologist, I learned at that time that as an anthropologist, you should not change the natural setting of your field area. So I did not intervene to that situation, and I did not go and try. I did not take any attempt to save that woman from that situation, but I came home with a guilt feeling, and also I there was a conflict in my mind at that time, and still now I have the same conflict, like from, feminist scholars, feminism comes together with activism and scholarly contribution. And for ethnographer, it's we strictly learn that you should not change the natural setting of your field research. So I was in a conflict at that time, and still now I think I have the guilty feeling about not intervening that situation, not rescue that woman from there. But yeah, I'm confused. It's still not resolved, that issue. Actually, I'm still with it, and I'd like to hear from the audience. Actually, I can see there are many experts there. Maybe they can help us with this.
Very good.
Thanks,
Just before that, could you ask your question to Maya, your ethnographic question to Maya, and then we'll have a more generalized discussion. Thank you.
So Maya, in your vivid descriptions of birthing, faith healing, and rights activism, my favorite is the one where you are assisting the birth of a woman along with her relatives and the midwife. It's my favorite, which was the most rewarding experience for you, ethnographically, if pushed to choose.
Oh my God! The thing is, I think that's a difficult question, and because I've never actually thought I had to choose. As number one, and number two, I think overall, the most rewarding ethnographic moments are precisely when you're with, you actually hear from, interact with, and are at, in a situation where I think things are happening, people are doing things, and they're also talking to you, but you're not the dominant person there. It is, you're learning from people talking to each other or doing things to each other, and they have accepted you as someone who is a legitimate presence in some ways, and I think and someone to be trusted. And I think that is the most rewarding kind of experience, I would say, and in a context where you must think about the complete power imbalances, because nobody is walking into my life and saying, can I do this, what do you have time for this? And and these are women who are very busy, who have their own lives, and not just women, but also also with different groups of people, like with maybe gynecologists, or with healers. Again, most rewarding was really understanding and being present at those ceremonies of healing, around infertility, both within familial context and also with in more sort of more public context. I mean, one of the things that was amazing for me was realizing soon and slowly though, that there was a whole separate universe of people engaged in reproduction, reproductive healing, compared to the sort of gynecologists or people I knew. And so these kind of things, these moments of kind of being part of and discovery, I think are for me the most rewarding of this work.
Thanks, Maya. Thanks, Papreen. David, those were the 4 questions I had to ask.
Well, thank you so much. Now, from our audience, who would like to ask something? I think the easiest way, if you could just kindly put your hand up virtually, then we can certainly then just go forward with your question. There we are. I've got several in order that we see them. Then would Patricia Jeffrey like to go ahead, please? And then Ava Fix, then Rafia Ramin.
the
So I think,
unmute.
Yeah.
there we are.
Yeah,
Now
no,
we
I
can hear
did.
you.
I did
Please,
click
please
the
go ahead.
unmute and it didn't unmute. Sorry about that. Thanks very much, Papreen and Maya. It's a long time since I've seen you both. I've seen Anindita much more recently, and I think she's probably more up to speed with what I'm busy doing at the moment, which is finishing a manuscript on topics that actually cut right across the things that you've both been talking about, but in Western UP, in a Muslim village. I could ask a load of questions, but one of the things that I maybe would like to ask somewhat provocatively is this issue about just what the introduction of JSY and incentivizing women to deliver in institutions actually brings positively in relation to women's reproductive rights, because I would have a much more queasy response perhaps than Maya's seemed to be. Maybe I'm misreading you there, but for one thing, I felt that, and the women in the village themselves said, that the incentive payments simply do not, on the balance sheet, add up to a benefit, because by the time they have paid inam to the people who've done things to them, for them, they are well out of pocket compared with the situation of home deliveries when they had the dai delivering the baby, and that you're talking about a few hundred rupees. You're sometimes talking about several thousand rupees, even for a vaginal delivery. And obviously, if you get into the business of a private hospital who insists on a C-section, you're talking about 30, 40,000 rupees. And alongside that as well, I just wonder, in terms of all the discussions about obstetric violence, I'm not saying that home deliveries are devoid of obstetric violence, because I think I've seen enough of those to know that that's not the case. But I mean, the wider literature on obstetric violence in institutions is quite hair-raising. And one of the aspects of that the women in my village allude to is having IUDs inserted without their knowledge and consent after they've had deliveries in the district hospital. And as a consequence, they're voting with their feet and either going to local private clinics, which might or might not be fit for purpose, but which are certainly very expensive, or else they're going to the local health centre, which is certainly cheaper, and it's a 5-minute walk across the fields, but the babies are being delivered by the usher, who is actually not mandated to do deliveries, and there really are no facilities if there's an emergency. And she, for instance, like many, many other providers, is administering oxytocin during labour, but in a way that is completely contrary to the protocols. So my response to all of these sort of things perhaps is a little bit more negative in terms of women's reproductive rights than you were perhaps suggesting. And I'll leave it there because I've got 1,000 other comments. But
well, would any of our audience like to answer? What do you think?
Shall I go ahead and answer?
Sorry, I muted myself again. Yes, I was primarily, I guess, addressed at Maya, because although infertility has been part of what I've done, it's a rather minor part.
Thanks, Patricia, and lovely to see you. Thank you for joining this. And so yes, I think there are again two or three different points to raise in relation to this. One is that one of the points I'm making in the book is actually that institutional deliveries are, despite the cash incentives, are actually more unsafe than safe. So that kind of ties in with your points there. And they're unsafe for several reasons, as you've also put out there. That one being, of course, that, and as the gynecologists themselves would say, that we are being forced to carry out these deliveries on people who we have no reproductive history of. So there is no long-term, long durée care of women that they know what the issues are. So that suddenly you're presented with someone who has very low blood counts, who can hemorrhage on your delivery table, and you can't do anything about it. So actually, there isn't that long durée of care. There isn't, apart from, of course, all the other costs that are involved, both sort of material costs in terms of paying for everything when you get to the hospital, which isn't free, cleaning your bed, cleaning the blood around, if you need any medication, that's not provided. So in all these senses, it is actually not as safe. It cannot be assumed that just giving birth in a hospital means that you have good quality of care, or that you won't have any issues to do with, it is the best possible outcomes for you. So I think that again, this idea that the state has, as I argue in the book, about just by providing and saying that they're providing these hospitals, but doesn't really address women's rights in that sense. But having said that, there have also been contexts where, and this is from NGOs who work in the area, such as in Udaipur, and this very good NGO called Earth, and they have really, and the gynecologists who work there have said that there has been a dramatic turnaround, for instance, in birth outcomes for both mother and child with these move to hospitals. So we are having conflicting data coming out. That's all I can say at this general level. But I think we cannot assume that these are necessarily safe places with good birth outcomes. I think I'll just leave it there. I mean, I think it is we need more work on this.
Well, thank you very much. Now, thank you very much for your question. Before we move on to the next one, did that answer your question? Are you happy with the response? I think so. Right. So the next person is Ava Fix, please, if you would like to go ahead and ask your question.
Yeah. Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for such an interesting discussion and for brightening up my afternoon, which was very rainy and stormy up until now. I wrote my question for Maya, but I think that actually it would be interesting to hear from both of you. So it's a twofold question about reproductive justice, and I wanted just to know about, so how do women that you encountered in your respective fields imagine reproductive justice? What does it look like to them? And on the other hand, so what kind of justice work they carry out themselves or demand to be carried out on their behalf for the reproductive violence that they encounter at the hands of families or public healthcare infrastructure, or their failures to address their needs and so on. So this kind of juxtaposition between, so what does justice or Nyay Mil Gaya, what does that look like for them? How do they imagine it? And on the other hand, what kind of work needs to be carried out to get there?
Papreen, should I go first, or do you want to?
You can go first, Maya.
Okay. So thank you very much, Eva, for that really pertinent question. And you're absolutely right. So how do women think about reproductive? How do they think about Nyay? And here's where I want to bring in again some, what I'm trying to say in the book is that reproduction isn't only about reproduction. It's and that sense, that idea about labor, that so reproductive labor and general labor. So similarly Nyay or justice isn't for women, isn't only about the fact that they can they don't get kicked while they're pregnant, while they're working. Nyay means that they also get food, they also get, they're treated well, And so this can be treated well generally in terms of, not having constant dowry demands. It's a kind of combination. I mean, and this is where I want to broaden out this focus of reproductive justice, where it is actually at the end of the day addressing, and that's the work we need to do, gender equality, poverty, that kind of intersection that women's lives are at, and reproduction is at that kind of intersection. It's at the intersection of huge amounts of sort of both kind of gender discrimination, and this is the irony, that reproduction is so highly valued, right? Fertility is so highly valued, and yet the people who deliver it are so devalued. So it really, that's the kind of huge amount of work that one needs to do when we are thinking morally in terms of what is right. What do these women deserve, for what they're doing. And so I'm sorry, it's not a specific answer to your question, but I think that that the way that justice is demanded, and that's why it's justice rather than rights, because rights don't capture that. They capture individual things like my right to go to the hospital, or my right to this, or my right to medicine. So those are individual things, rather than rather than more generally that sense of justice that I have been looked after by the state, by the family, when I'm pregnant. But that includes being looked after and being fed when I'm not pregnant, because the things are connected. I will be an anemic, weak, childbearing woman if I haven't been fed when I've been growing up, and if I've been born from another anemic childbearing woman. So it's really about these long senses of thinking about reproduction. And I guess one of the ways the policy thing goes wrong is if it is just so focused on the discrete, this idea of reproduction and reproductive health as being discrete, separable. And yeah, so that's sorry, that's my answer. Sorry, Papreen, answers over to you.
Thanks, Eva, for a very interesting question. In my case, I particularly did not discuss the justice issue with my participants. So I really don't have voice from them about justice. What I can talk about it based on my ethnographic elements is that to them, probably justice is being included within the society and from the service provision. So, and like if they could be included within the service and within the society, and at the moment from my data, as I have shown, that they are systematically excluded from the society and from the, when I said society, it's family and the community, and also from the state. So inclusivity probably is the core for them. So they probably want to be included within the structure that they are living in. And on a on a visible level, probably stop stigmatizing them, stop violence against them, stop providing service for them. So these will be on a surface level for them from justice point of view, but on a deeper level, I think they want to be included and not to be marginalized by the structure and structural forces. That's my response, I think.
Thank you. And Anindita, did you have something you'd like to add to that?
Thanks, Eva. I've been thinking about reproductive justice, which is now becoming a very important context of my work, and I did not begin to look at reproductive justice in my current research on aging and IVF. But I find the policy, the missing conversation about infertility in policy, which Papreen has flagged, as well as Maya, is a very important part of the conversation around reproductive justice. So women seeking IVF at an older age when they are at risk of actually dying of assisted pregnancies is an important context to talk about reproductive justice, especially in terms of how patriarchy and state can align in pushing women into birthing at different ages. And I think that is becoming an important thing to think about. And the fact that women in India, especially in rural India, in India and in South Asia, actually have to be educated. And I use the word educated with all the writers, have to be made aware about what they think is, their reproductive justice is, or the fight for reproductive justice. So that's a very important question now. I'm changing context. And we have to, I think, identify the layers at which, and I think that's been done in Maya's work and in Papreen's work, the layers at which women think about reproductive justice and are linked to reproductive justice. It's different in South Asia for rural poor, urban rich, rural rich, and across caste and religion. So I don't know but thanks, David. Thanks for that. Thanks for that question.
Well, thank you very much indeed. What a fascinating discussion. So now, Rafia Rahman, please, if you would like to ask your question.
Hi, everyone. So I think the last part of the discussion sort of touched on this question, but I wanted to ask you, Papreen, that, you talked about how women experience social and economic consequences because of childlessness, but the local reproductive policies don't really address infertility. So I was just, thinking about like how that dynamic sort of correlates to the way women's needs are viewed within Bangladeshi society, or or society across Southeast Asia.
I think yes, the exclusion that I have already mentioned, that it's it is they are the victim of social exclusion and policy exclusion, or structural exclusion, and for that they are facing these issues, and it's hard to actually pinpoint where to start and which part of the problem needs to be adjusted or healed first. So it's the movement has to be integrated from different parts of the society, or different types of the stakeholders, I think. And for that, very many the health force, and at the same time women activist force, and from the other forces which actually intersects with this problem, if they could start working together, and only then probably it's possible to make some kind of changes. But at the top of everything, I think there has to be some kind of policy included in the reproductive health policy about infertility, and minimum level of services, for example, diagnostic facilities, or counseling facilities, for example. So, yeah, that's my response. Is that what you asked? Sorry, did it give the answer of your question? Or
yeah, thank you. Yeah, I was also thinking about, how, sort of women's worth were, felt in the society, and our women's needs, was seen, because it's kind of like, because I read your book and I found it really, inspirational, because I'm also working on my fieldwork in Bangladesh. And yeah, it's almost felt like that women were they have to be mothers, so there's no point in addressing infertility, because that's what they are supposed to do. So yeah, so that sort of attempted me to think about if there if the society feel the need to address infertility, and or just just consider this as something that women, like, because they're women, they have to give birth or have a child or be mothers.
Yes, just to add one point to this is that, like, of course, societal views needs to be changed as well. I mean, it is still very much like at the beginning in my book, I also, I think the third chapter I wrote about the value of children in the society. So that kind of views also needs to be changed. And for that, it's that kind of movement should come from the women's activist group within the country. For example, Nari Pokho, Mohila Samiti, as you know, they exist there. And they had started like maybe 20 years back, a little bit of work on infertility, but so far in recent years, I haven't seen anything, things like that. So yeah, that's another area needs to be addressed.
Thank you.
Well, thank you very much. And now we move to our next question, which is Arushi Sahai, please.
Hi, thank you. Sorry, I would be unable to switch on my camera because of really bad internet. But yeah, thank you for such an interesting discussion. My question was for both these speakers. It's quite a general and maybe a bit cliched question around where and how do men figure in the landscape of reproductive rights and justice in both of your research. I think especially in the context of healthcare seeking practices and going to the clinics and claiming certain kinds of benefits, and specifically, of course, as spouses and husbands and partners. And I think I asked this in reference to some of my own ongoing fieldwork and insights, which is also based in Rajasthan, where I see that at one hand, there's a lot of push from both like policy and NGOs on this involvement of men and like couple-based interventions, especially around like family planning and contraception. But on the other, what I see on like my visits to like clinics or talking to women is this really deliberate effort from and within women to keep these spaces as women-centric, something which they express that they have a control of and they know better and like they have a hold on. And like that reflects in their relationship between like female relatives with their mothers, sisters, or even between like ASHA workers and counselors and women, and how they interact in these spaces as almost like safe spaces where like men sit outside in a different room or don't come at all. So yeah, I was just curious to know how men figured in each of your research and fields.
Papreen, do you want to go ahead?
Sure. In my research, I mostly focused on women, and main story came through the women's life history. So I actually did not do any interview with any men. None of my participants were men. And broadly, in terms of service provision, it is probably the same for men as it is for women. There is nothing for the rural poor or even for the urban poor. But as you know, in a patriarchal society, even, I mean, they are, first of all, in the rural area, I found that men were not identified as infertile in a very short period of time of their marriage life. So, like I said, that they have, first of all, society do not identify them as an infertile, and even if at one point of their life, if they are identified, they will not be facing the social marginalization that women face in the same society. So that's one thing. And also men have other options, like after some, in some of my participants' case, I found that when after getting second marriage, that men actually flee away from that village and settle somewhere in other town, other urban, nobody knows where he is. And he started probably another life with another woman and spend another 5 years. People will not ask. And after 4 or 5 years, probably people will start talking about that person. Then they will have that opportunity of skipping the social scrutiny and also marginalization. But at the same time, it is difficult within the society, even though the level of marginalization are not same as women, but it's not very simple and easy for them as well. And in terms of service provision, there is also very limited service for them as well. And just wanted to say that recently, because of the recent interest from the international forces on male involvement, there are scopes for doing infertility research with men as well as other reproductive health issues. And actually pretty soon I'm going to start another study on male infertility, which has been funded already. So I'll be able to tell you more about male infertility in 2 years' time. Thank you.
So thanks, Arushi, for your question. And of course, men figure centrally in, as they should, in discussions on reproductive rights and reproductive justice. In the book, in my book, they figure as kind of policymakers, they figure as NGO workers, they figure as lawyers, they figure as healers, but they have both sort of facilitative functions. They facilitate and support particularly, women's kind of issues to do with reproductive rights, but they are also disruptive in that. So certain kinds of abortion providers would say that I am trained to provide abortions, but I will never provide a woman with an abortion because I think it's morally wrong. So in that sense, they kind, and I think, of course, I think the other issue is that actually reproduction itself needs to be an area which is owned by men, because I think the fact that it isn't it's always seen as something that women, it has to do with women, is something that both debilitates men as well, and this is to do with sort of male infertility. And also in terms of turning around the discourse, that actually, among the women who I met, they would say, well, no, a man can never be infertile. And so in order to also share that burden of infertility and own that kind of sense of reproductive accountability, I think there has to be, and it's happening now quite a lot, where there's much more of men being, as Papreen was saying, being involved now in reproductive health programs globally, nationally. The other thing that I would say is that with the rise, particularly in technological means of addressing infertility, more men are coming forward because it seems to be less stigmatized. Because again, I would say that while the stigma for women is great and the suffering is great, as Papreen also has shown in Bangladesh, for men, of course, it's devastating, because it is about how you can't be a man. Like, you can't be a woman if you're infertile. You can't be a man either. But what certain studies have shown, like you must be well aware of Marcia Inhorn's study in Egypt, where once things are now at a technological level, that and there is more prestige in people who can access these technologies, more male infertility is being brought out and being recorded. And I think we see that also coming from this end of the world, the global north, that the declining levels of of fertility are are equally shared, and there's a lot of male infertility as well. So people are talking more about it, and I think it's, and I think that in that sense, the injustice of either men not being able to participate if they're infertile, or not wanting to, or being also erased, are important issues that I can see your work is going to look at that. Thanks.
Well, thank you so much. Would you like to make a last comment, Anindita? We're very nearly out of time.
Sorry, David, there's one more person whose hand I can see.
Oh, really?
Yeah,
Well, let's go for
Anil.
them. I'm so sorry. I didn't see it. Please,
Anil,
who are
Anil
you afraid
Bra.
to Anya? I'm so sorry. Absolutely. Go ahead, please.
No problem. I was enjoying listening to everything. So maybe, so I'm actually, I guess I could say I'm a man who's interested and engaged in women's health, and finding himself engaged with feminist anthropology and activist anthropology. And I'll give a bit of a background as a preface to the comment that responds to Professor Jeffrey's comment on JSY. So I run a nonprofit, a maternal health nonprofit in Rajasthan, actually, a different part of Rajasthan that Professor Unnithan works in the north. And so I've been doing that work for about 12 years. And over that time, I've seen JSY be implemented. And at the same time, so institutional births have skyrocketed. So from about 50% to like well over 90% now. And also maternal mortality rates have decreased incredibly. And of course, it's hard to posit any causation between those things, but the correlation is very interesting. And so, as a healthcare provider through my nonprofit, we focus on vulnerable women and try to get them the care that they need. I'm very interested in this trend, but then with the hat of an anthropologist and an ethnographer, it's interesting to see. And actually, this is I'm really thankful for Professor Unnithan's influence on this, of looking how global discourses can be translated locally. So to me, the JSY is very influenced by neoliberal discourses, right? It's commodifying healthcare, and it gets translated locally. And then so what happens? Well, I guess maybe the good thing is, and I've definitely seen this in my setting, is that people are getting the emergency obstetric care they need. They're getting access to that if they need it. Their births are attended well. But then, of course, there are all these negative things that happen too. And ethnographers were trained to kind of see these complexities. And of course, if you're giving cash, costs tend to go up. So people have to pay for their caregivers, people have to pay for all kinds of new things that they didn't have to pay for before. And so at the end of the day, you're not really up monetarily. But what was interesting is, so a few years ago, I did a survey of my catchment area to see why people so it was like well over 90% of people delivered in a hospital. So the few that delivered at home, I interviewed them and asked them, why did you deliver at home? And most of the people who delivered at home, so this was about 1 or 2% of the people we surveyed, it was usually their second delivery that happened at home. So they had an experience in the hospital, went through the process, and they delivered at home because they had such a poor experience. So they experienced violence or disrespect or whatever the case may be. Or some people were just cold or they didn't feel comfortable. But the other thing that happened was their consciousness changed around childcare or childbirth. And so rather than just delivering at home kind of haphazardly, this time they were thinking about, oh, well, how do I ensure I have access to emergency care if I need it? So they had a doctor on call, or they just had things in place. So yeah, I mean, it's just interesting. And so maybe I can go back to the last question that Dr. Majumdar asked about ethnography. So I feel like our role is to see how these global discourses are translated locally and how they actually play out. And I feel like ethnographers are in a really good place to be activists in that we can translate back what's going on and improve the discourse a bit. based on what's actually happening. So we can see the good and the bad. Anyway, just a comment. Thank you so much for everybody's. It was very enlightening. So thank you.
Well, thank you very much indeed. We are sadly out of time now, but it's been an enthralling discussion, and I would like to thank all three of our distinguished speakers and the audience for giving us such a wonderful time. Please do join in the RA activities. Please do join us as a fellow if you're not already, so that we can carry on doing these wonderful things together. But just for now, I shall have to say good night and thank you very much. And I'll leave Haneen to close everything down. Thank you.
Thank you.